Now let's address another common entry point of confusion for those who are relatively new to Oracle. What's the difference between a database and an instance? With 12c actually, and you notice that down toward the bottom of the slide I highlight new features in red. I hope that'll help those of you who are currently Oracle experts get to what's important for you. But it's gotten a little bit more complicated, but traditionally a database and an instance are in a one-to-one relationship. In a single instance installation, you have your instance, which is the shared memory areas, like the system global area, the private memory areas, it's called the private global area or PGA, and then your background processes. We'll talk about the background processes in the next module that support the database proper. And in Oracle, as I said earlier, the database in Oracle refers to file system objects. Now, you could make the argument, aren't background processes file system objects? I mean, it's executable code. Yes, don't go there though. Okay, just follow me here. The database refers to files like your data files that are your binary objects that actually contain your row data and your indexes, your online redo log files, which again are binary files that store a record of DML and DDL changes to your database that are used in database recovery if something bad were to happen to your database. Your control files, which provide intelligence to the instance as to where all of these components are, and so on. Now, I said that the issue of database and instance gets a little bit more complex. What I mean by that is that up to Oracle 12c, you had either a single instance where if you wanted a database installed, you would install an instance and then you'd create a database that goes along with that instance. Question for you, do you think a single Oracle server can have more than one database on the same box? The answer to that question is yes. You can do that, but you'll have separate sets of background processes, separate SGAs, separate PGAs, and if you're thinking to yourself, wow, that's a lot of RAM and CPU and potentially disk space, you're absolutely correct on that. Now the clustered instance, what's called the grid instance, remember that 11G is grid, but you can do grid just as much with 12C. This involves two or more nodes or database servers that have the Oracle binaries installed. They are instances, but the difference with a clustered environment, what's called RAC, Real Application Cluster, is that those nodes are focused on shared storage and a single database. What's even better is that you can set up your grid in an active-active configuration. Typically in a cluster, maybe a SQL Server cluster, you have active-passive, where one node is actively up, accessing the data files, and the other ones are just basically sitting there twiddling their proverbial thumbs. With Oracle RAC, we can have active-active, which is parallelization, because we can support more user access at once. And those nodes are always communicating with themselves so they won't step on each other's changes, you see. Data integrity is absolutely crucial in the relational model. Now, what's new and what's changed here? In Oracle Database 12c, we have a very, very fundamental shift toward a multi-tenant architecture. And what this is, it's one-to-many, but instead of it being many instances to one clustered database, with multi-tenant, it's just the opposite. You have one container database in one instance, and then you can have one or more pluggable databases or PDBs plugged into that container database. Isn't that cool? Each of the pluggable databases has its own private area, its own users, its own schema. As far as your applications and users are concerned, those pluggable databases might as well be in a single instance on a separate server. The idea with multi-tenancy is that you're consolidating or collapsing a whole bunch of what otherwise would be separate instances into a single instance. And that's great because it's going to reduce your cost of hardware and it's going to make it easier for you to manage multiple databases. This is especially important in a cloud environment. In a cloud environment, you may be offering database as a service, infrastructure as a service, or there are so many of those cloud buzzwords floating around. But in other words, you may have need to deploy several databases and you just don't have the hardware to put them all stacked in separate instances, you see. Finally, you can do updates, patching, that kind of stuff just once on the CDB instead of every time for every database. We'll be getting more and more. We'll be circling back on the multi-tenant architecture as we move through this course.